All right, welcome everybody on this beautiful, beautiful Monday evening of October 11th, 2021. Um, I just got done making up some lectures, so I thought, what the hell, why not actually record the lectures since I got done typing them out and stuff. Anyway, so given recent events in the news, and how Congress have been bickering over the debt ceiling and trying to raise the debt ceiling and all that stuff. I'm sure a lot of you have had questions about what that damn thing is. So I thought it would be kind of like a cool slash nice idea to actually explain that to you and do it in terms of like a special topic for this course where I can actually include a little bit of monetary policy stuff and kind of look at the role that monetary and fiscal policy play with one another in sort of like a combined context because they ultimately kind of happen in tandem. If you do really like anything with fiscal policy, there's going to be a little bit of like a monetary policy response. Doesn't always have to be, as we'll learn throughout some of these lectures, but right, they generally kind of occur in tandem. So, without any further ado, let's just get started. So, we're going to be talking about the debt ceiling. What is it? Why does it matter? Why do we care? What role does monetary policy play in this? Probably a big one that you're wondering right now. What happens if we don't raise the debt ceiling? Um, why is it currently being used as a political tool? Well, if you keep watching, you'll probably be lucky enough to find out. So let's go over just a brief history of the debt ceiling. Now, the debt ceiling is a limit that's set on the amount of debt that can be incurred by the United States Treasury. It restricts the amount of money the federal government can pay on the debt that they've already borrowed. Now, expenditures are authorized via separate legislation. This is probably like one part where some of you might be going like, all right, yeah, what the hell is this damn thing? Because if we're already like, if we've already voted to spend the money, why can't we spend the money? But it's actually done via two separate like pieces of legislation, and we'll kind of get into why. So there's a spending bill by Congress that gets passed, but it doesn't change the debt limits. It just changes how much can be spent, right? So the debt ceiling, um, the debt ceiling doesn't limit how much Congress can spend. Sorry, my brain died out for a second there, which is, it seems weird, right? Because you're like, well, the debt ceiling, it's a limit on the debt that we can take out. How does that not have anything to do with how much Congress can spend? Well, it it's two different things, right? Congress votes to spend, and then after that they'll have to vote to raise the debt ceiling if their spending bill is going to bump up against the debt ceiling, which is something we'll talk about in a second. Now, in 1917, during the First World War, Congress passed a law that established a debt ceiling. Before this, they had to pass legislation to increase how much they could borrow with every spending bill. But given we were in the middle of a war, right? World War One was pretty bad. You know, it's got the World War thing on it, like the whole world kind of took part in this whole thing. Um, so it seemed like it'd probably be a nice thing to do to make it a little bit easier on the Treasury. So what they could do now is issue bonds and take on debt without specific congressional approval every time they wanted to do that. Right? Seems easy. Seems pretty cool. Pretty nice thing to do. Right? But Congress essentially sets the debt ceiling now every so often, which limits how much of the national debt can actually be paid. And every year, Congress passes a spending bill. And every year, they usually spend more than they're bringing in via taxes. Right? So let's just kind of normalize their spending down to $1. So they want to spend $1. They only have 75 cents in tax revenue. They've got to borrow 25 cents. Now that 25 cents that they borrow adds to the deficit. So for this period, right, this year, this fiscal year, they want to spend $1. 25 cents of that dollar is the deficit, right? So we've got a 25-cent deficit this year. Now this deficit gets added to the national debt. If it adds up to a total national debt that is less than the debt ceiling, then hey, cool, no problem. Something we'll worry about later. If it adds up to a total national debt that's above the debt ceiling, well, then we're effed. So let's say the current national debt's $9.80. and the debt ceiling is currently at $10. Congress passes a spending bill for $1. 25 cents of that has to be borrowed. Now, the Treasury has to issue 25 cents in bonds to finance the spending bill, but legally they can't issue more than 20 cents in bonds. So Congress has to raise the debt ceiling to allow the Treasury to issue the remaining 5 cents in bonds. Now, usually Congress just votes to raise the debt ceiling to allow the Treasury to finance the stuff that's already been approved by Congress. It's usually done pretty quickly, pretty easily. Generally done kind of like under the radar. You never really hear about it all that often, but every once in a blue moon you'll hear about it, right? Now, whenever they want to, have federal spending, right? It's stuff to fund the federal government, like military, social security, all that stuff, right? It's also to repay existing debt because we can't just we can't just not raise it and expect everything to be fine. Now, I do want to note really quickly, this is not how much the government can spend or how much debt they can take on, right? That's already been voted on. That's already been taken care of. It's how much the government can pay on debt that's already been taken out. So, since its inception, it's been raised more than 70 times. So, why is it ever an issue? Well, the U.S. national debt's currently at $28.4 trillion. And the debt ceiling is set at 28.5. A little bit of a problem. So if Congress wants to pass a $1.2 trillion infrastructure package and the $3.5 trillion Build Back Better Act, well, they'd better raise that debt ceiling by a considerable amount. Come on, man. Now, the problem here is that $3.5 trillion bill. Now, it's sitting in the Senate. The $1.5 trillion infrastructure bill has enough Republican support to pass. The $3.5 trillion bill doesn't. In addition, 2 Democrats don't want to vote on the $3.5 trillion deal. And these 2 Democrats are Joe Manchin from West Virginia, Kyrsten Sinema from Arizona. Now, typically, bills in the Senate need 60 votes to pass. I'm sure you've heard about the whole filibuster thing before. That means bills in the Senate need 60 votes in order to be able to pass. But every so often, they can pass budget bills using something known as budget reconciliation. And they can do it 2, maybe 3 times a year, something like that. Now, it means that they only need 50 votes, or 50 votes in the tiebreaker from the vice president, in order to pass that legislation. Now, it's already been used once this year on the CARES Act, right? The STEMIs from earlier this year. So the $3.5 trillion bill can't even pass via reconciliation as it stands. It needs some revision before Sinema and Manchin would be willing to vote on it. And right now, Republicans oppose both the debt limit increase and the $3.5 trillion bill. Why? Well, in theory, the Senate doesn't need a single Republican vote to raise the debt ceiling because they can just use reconciliation to raise the ceiling. But the problem is, right, if they do that, they can't pass that $3.5 trillion bill. And Republicans know this. Republicans don't want that $3.5 trillion bill at all. So, in their eyes, Democrats can basically get one of the two, right? They can either raise the debt ceiling or they can get that $3.5 trillion bill. But Republicans are basically going, we're not going to help you on any of this stuff. Now, the debt ceiling's a bit more important. So, really what they're doing is they're forcing Democrats to forego the big spending bill, or at least big chunks of it. And since Republicans don't have a majority in the Senate, they can only exercise their power in so many ways. This just so happens to be one of them. Now, Democrats want both, so without Republican support for raising the debt ceiling, they're screwed. In short, we're screwed. Because if the government can't fund stuff like defense spending, Social Security, Medicare, National Park Services, education, repayment of existing national debts, etc., all those things, then the Treasury has to resort to what's known as extraordinary measures to make sure they can pay for it. If that doesn't work, ultimately the government shuts down. Various credit ratings agencies will downgrade our debt. This is bad, and this has happened before. Now, if we don't raise it, Treasury can't pay our existing debt. Then we will default on this debt, at least partially, right? We won't default on everything, but we'll default on some of it, or some of it will be paid out a little late. Now, when that happens, the U.S. gets a lower credit score. Right, so think about it just like with your own personal finance, right? If you've got some debt and you can't pay it off, right? You can't pay back your debt. What happens? Well, your credit card companies get really pissed at you. They start calling you a lot. They hassle you, and it's really overall pretty bad. And if you go long enough without paying anything, then you're like super screwed because it'll actually ding your credit score. So if that happens on like the national scale, well, the U.S. gets a lower credit score, and well, what happens when you get a lower credit score like on your credit cards, right? If you want to take out another line of credit, you're probably going to get hit with a larger interest rate. Now, sorry, I've got a lozenge. My head's been stuffy. My throat's been feeling weird all day. So if you hear any weird like clicking around or anything like that, it's a throat lozenge. Anyways, since these interest rates are considered the baseline for all other rates, right? So these treasury, the interest rates on government debt, I don't want to go too far into it, but think of that as kind of like the baseline for all other interest rates of similar maturities. It's like a floor almost, right, for these other interest rates. Since those are considered like a lower bound, so to speak, for all other interest rates in the economy, you increase that lower bound, then everything else is going to go up as well. We raise interest rates, especially right now where our economy is really not doing so well. We've got high inflation, we've got high unemployment, right? The recovery post coronavirus isn't really so hot. It's kind of slow. It's sluggish. It's uneven across sectors. It's not a very good recovery. If you raise interest rates right now, boom, recession. That is also bad. So, don't we have to raise the debt ceiling then? Well, the answer is yes, and the answer is also we will. This is a tactic that's being used by the Republicans to force out bills that they don't like because ultimately not raising it is political suicide, and they know this. The debt ceiling will be raised. This tactic's been used in the past to force the hand of the majority party in Congress to not go too crazy with their spending. So, are there any issues with just raising it all the time? I mean, it's usually raised to very little fanfare in the media at all, right? Unless you're really either closely following what Congress is doing or you're very closely following like financial markets or anything like that, you're probably not even going to hear about it, right? Like I've been studying the economy for well over 10 years of my life now, and most of the time the debt ceiling's been raised while I've been studying the economy. I haven't even really heard about it. So, what does that tell you? An economist doesn't even know every single time the debt ceiling's been raised. So, there usually aren't issues with just raising it. What's going on now? Well, aside from what I said, there's also the concern about the amount of debt we'll be taking on, like what our new national debt will be. Because we can't really just take out more and more debt, right? Because, I mean, okay, we take out some debt, we pay it back. Fine, great. What happens if we take out too much debt, right? How are we going to pay that back? Well, if we were to take out debt and we got to pay it back, we do it one of two ways, either taxes or inflation. Now, neither one is particularly good, especially considering any additional inflation right now is going to hammer us pretty hard. Our economy can't really handle any more inflation than what it's got. Now, the inflation is argued to be transitory. I, having seen the data very recently, do believe it will be transitory. I think there are a lot of things that are driving inflation that's not entirely just like monetary policy. We've got relatively loose monetary policy at the moment. However, or I'm sorry, as Chair Powell likes to say, accommodative policy and their accommodative stance on monetary policy. We've done that before, and we haven't seen massive increases in inflation, right? That's not so much the issue. Now, the Fed does need to wind down their balance sheet soon, but they also will be doing that. The inflation is caused by a lot of other things like supply chain issues, labor shortages. I'm sure anywhere you go, anywhere, any store you go to, any restaurant you go to, you're probably going to see a now hiring sign. Probably also stuck waiting in line way longer than you would like because pretty much everywhere you go is wildly short staffed. So that's not very good. Now, taxes. We could always talk about taxes, but here's a problem on the taxes, right? Our economy hasn't really recovered. You don't want to raise taxes when the economy's not doing so well. If you're interested on what the fiscal side of the causes for the Great Depression were, well, taxes. The dipshits increased taxes when we were in a really nasty recession after 1929, and boom, we hit a depression. Now, there was also a monetary side to that, but I'm kind of rambling on and on and on about that stuff. The point of everything I just said there is taxes are extremely undesirable at the moment. Well, higher taxes. Taxes are always undesirable. Taxation is theft, if you ask me. And there goes my YouTube ban right there. Taxes are undesirable. Higher taxes are extremely undesirable. And inflation is undesirable at the moment, right? These two things have to be handled, especially right now, in extreme moderation. So, we will be talking about both. That wraps up this particular lecture on this, sort of like an introductory lecture. The next lecture is going to go into like government budget constraints, the fiscal authorities constraint, the monetary authorities constraint. After that, we're going to talk about like sustainable debt growth, and then we'll cover this other topic called Ricardian equivalence. So we've got a few more lectures coming up, and then that will be the end of the set of lectures for the first exam. So pay close attention. Be on the lookout for more videos. They will be coming, and you will hear from me then, which will be relatively soon.